are better ways to do payment channels. For example, the Lightning Network does not use these one-way payment channels, but I really like them, especially as a teaching tool because they're super simple. You only need like two primitives, and then they're also really powerful, as I'll go through a few examples of things you can do with them. But basically, you can do almost anything. I may even say you can do anything that the Lightning Network can do with a one-way payment channel with like some tiny tweaks to your security assumptions, and then just less scalably. So the Lightning Network's more scalable, but they're very powerful. One-way payment channel is very powerful. Okay, so what we have is two people, Alice and Bob, and they want to create a payment channel so that, in this case, Alice can pay Bob a bunch of times repeatedly and not have to make a new transaction on the Bitcoin network every time. And so we're doing something like, say, downloading a file. And so if we have to pay 1 million times, we don't want to bloat the chain. We don't want to pay transaction fees. We'll create a payment channel for this like repeat customer scenario in one way. And so all that we're going to need to do this one-way payment channel is a multisig and a time lock. And so what we do is, if Alice is paying Bob, Alice is going to take all the money, put it into a 2 of 2 output, or a 2 of 2 transaction that to spend requires both Alice's signature and Bob's signature. And there's going to be a second clause to this output or to this transaction that says, after some amount of time has passed, and then I'll be using an example of 10 days, Alice can spend all the money however she wants. So that means if Bob, for whatever reason, is unavailable, goes away, some tragic accident happens, Alice can recover the money. So Alice is protected after 10 days. So Alice may lose access to the funds for 10 days if Bob is not cooperating, but then Alice can recover the money. So we need that timeout there. Otherwise, that's all we need is a 2 of 2 or 1 of 2 after a timeout, or Alice only after a timeout. So the setup transaction needs to be confirmed on the blockchain before it's safe to spend. The reason we have this setup is because when Bob's getting paid, if the transaction's not confirmed, Bob doesn't have any confidence that Alice can't go and do a double spend. So we need to get it on the chain so the money is definitely committed, definitely locked up, and there's no trickery that Alice can pull on Bob. Okay, so for the initial spend, Alice is just going to create a new transaction that spends this money. It's a 2 of 2, so Alice can't actually finish the transaction. But Alice is going to move some of the money. You can think of it, there's like 10 bitcoins over here, 0 over here, and Alice is going to move a tiny amount of bitcoins in Bob's direction, sign that transaction, and give it to Bob. So now Bob has a transaction. Bob's going to keep it safe. It pays him, 0.1 bitcoins or whatever, some small amount. And at any time that he wants, Bob can sign this transaction, broadcast it to the blockchain, and get that money. And so, most of the money goes back to Alice. A tiny bit of money goes to Bob. But the most important thing is that Bob controls this. Alice has no control over the situation, at least until the time lock hits. And then, conversely, now that Bob has this transaction, Bob has to make sure to spend it before the time lock releases. Because if Bob doesn't, Alice can just go spend the coins using a 1 out of 2, or using just her key, and give all the money to herself, which is what she's likely going to do. She's going to assume that Bob is missing for some reason, and that money is not going to be claimed. So it rightfully belongs to Alice after the 10 days. So Bob has to be careful. So that's one limitation here. Now, if Alice wants to pay Bob again, all Alice does is remembers like a running total of how much money Bob's been paid. You're going to increase that amount by however much Alice wants to pay Bob. The second time, Alice will sign a new transaction and send it to Bob. So Bob now has 2 transactions. If we do this a bunch of times, Bob's going to receive throughout the course of the channel, say, thousands of transactions. And Bob can choose at any time any of the transactions. So Bob is not restricted to choosing the most recent transaction. I think I covered that in the, yeah. Bob's not restricted to choosing the most recent transaction, which means that the most amount of money that Bob has ever had in any of the transactions that's the amount of money that Bob is able to claim. That's why these payment channels are one way. There's no way for Alice to sort of like claw money back, because Bob can easily just use an old transaction. And then as before, if Bob wants to claim the money, Bob has to spend the desired transaction before the time lock hits. So that's pretty simple. So I'm going to give an example, downloading files. Alice creates a transaction with Bob, a payment channel to Bob. Bob's running a video streaming service like Netflix. Bob's charging, let's say, some amount of money per movie. And so initially, what Bob's going to do is Bob's just going to trust Alice. Bob's going to risk 1 megabyte. In this example, Bob's going to choose to risk 1 megabyte. So Bob gives Alice 1 megabyte of data for free. Then Alice has to pay for it. If Alice doesn't pay for it, Bob, was a sucker and lost a whole megabyte, like 0.25 seconds of video or something. And so it's not a big deal. Alice and Bob just go their separate ways, and they don't talk to each other ever again because they can't be friends. So the Lightning Network, just to contrast against the Lightning Network can be atomic and can make it so that this, maybe not for video downloading, but in general, the Lightning Network can make it so that these transactions don't have this little risk window. But with one-way payment channels, we can make this risk window arbitrarily small, and in my opinion, that's good enough for the practical world. And so basically, if Alice is downloading a 1080p movie, which can be anywhere from 4 to 20 gigabytes, you're talking between 4,000 and 20,000 transactions. Even at $50, the most Alice can ever steal from Bob is 1 cent worth of data. And Bob's pretty comfortable with that, especially if Alice is expected to be a repeat customer. And again, if Alice ever defrauds Bob, Bob just won't ever give Alice movies again. Is sort of like the end of the relationship. And Alice has to go find a new video streaming platform. So yeah, I think that's a pretty powerful thing. We didn't see it in practice on the Bitcoin network very much. Even today, we don't really see those things. There are a couple libraries for it, and I think earn.com tried to implement this, and a couple other services, maybe some of the video streaming erotica platforms tried to use this. But overall, I don't think any of them ever really took off. But they could have. Using just this. And this is, this all works pre-SegWit. This all works on older versions of Bitcoin, which I think is super cool. Okay, double one-way payment channels. So we can make these two-way just by having one that goes from Alice to Bob, and one that goes from Bob to Alice, and then they can pay each other if they want to move the net amount of money, who owns what, to either side. They can do it just by pushing down one channel or pushing down the other. This is the same thing. This effectively emulates the Lightning Network with one exception. In the Lightning Network, when you push money back, you can push money back and forth an unlimited amount of times, and you never need to make an on-chain transaction again. If you're doing the two one-way payment channels, as you push money back and forth, at some point, one or both of the channels is going to be depleted. You have to make a new on-chain transaction. So that's where I said I believe it is the same power as the Lightning Network, but if you're going to use it the way you use the Lightning Network, you're going to need more on-chain transactions than you need with the Lightning Network. Whereas, in the Lightning Network, in theory, if your bank is in the Lightning Network, and Whole Foods is in the Lightning Network, and your landlord's in the Lightning Network, and your work, your paycheck is coming from the Lightning Network, you never need to make more than your initial transactions on the Lightning Network, because the outputs just all push against each other and rebalance over time as you earn and spend money. So yeah, you can do two-way payment channels with a one-way payment channel base. So we can actually do trustless cryptocurrency swaps using just this, which I think is pretty cool. In early Bitcoin, you could also do something called an atomic swap, which we'll probably cover in some other talk. But atomic swaps require this hash reveal scheme, which means your script system has to support hashing. And early Bitcoin did, so it wasn't an issue. But I think this is cool because we can get that same functionality without hashing. So what we do, let's say Alice has Litecoins, Bob has Bitcoins, Alice can create a one-way payment channel to Bob that's sending him Litecoins. Bob can create a one-way payment channel to Alice that's sending him Bitcoins. And then they'll do the same thing. So they'll trade, one tiny, a 0.1% at a time, back and forth. At any point in time, one of them is taking a risk. We'll say Alice is the one who initiated the trade, so it makes sense that the initiator takes the risk because they have the choice of choosing who to initiate with. So they take the risk, and then you're off. So if we assume that, computers are fast, right? And if Alice and Bob are across the world, they could probably do 4 trades per second. So if we're doing 1 cent, 0.1 cents at a time, we can do $10 in about 45 minutes, which isn't going to break any records, but it's cool. But also we can use an exponential function to actually speed things up a lot. So if what we do is instead of sending 0.1 cents every trip, we send 0.1 cents, or we send the amount we sent last time times 1.02. We increase it by 2% every iteration. The way the math works out is that the most amount of money that's ever at risk for Alice is 2% of the total amount so far transacted. It takes a couple iterations to get there, right? Because the first iteration, that's 100%, 0.1 cents out of 0.1 cents. But over time, it converges to 2% total at risk. This is less than what Visa charges, so I think that's pretty reasonable. And if you start at a 0.1 cent transaction and you scale it by 2% per iteration, you're doing four iterations a second, you can get to $5 in 60 seconds, you can get to $600 in 2 minutes, and you can get to $70,000 in 3 minutes. And of course, if you're willing to wait 10 minutes, you can go forever. You can get to infinite money relatively easily. The other thing that you can do, if 2% is too high, you can knock it down to say 0.5% exponential growth, so your risk window is a lot smaller, but you still have this exponential growth. That just means getting started, instead of it being 1, 2, 3 minutes, it might be like 10, 20, 30 minutes. I didn't do the math out on that, but it's still, you will finish by the end of the day. It's just a matter of how much risk you're willing to take versus how long you have to complete a large transaction. Cool. I think I'm not going to do that slide because I think I made a mistake on it. But the general idea is that you can turn this into, instead of just like a one-way exchange, you can create an entire network where Alice can, say, pay Charlie through a network of channels. And so if Alice has Litecoin and a channel with Bob, Bob has, Dogecoin and a channel with Charlie. Alice can pay Charlie without having, maybe I did get that right. Alice can pay Charlie without having a payment channel with Charlie by trusting Bob for that little tiny window. So Alice will trust Bob, send Bob some money with the caveat like, hey Bob, you need to forward this money. Bob will forward the money, maybe taking a 0.01% fee or something, some reason for Bob to facilitate this. But it's just a network transaction, right? It's like a network packet. It's very cheap for Bob to do this, so the fee doesn't need to be very high. Bob pushes the money to Charlie, and then Charlie gets paid. Charlie can stream video to Alice. Charlie can give Alice groceries. Charlie can give her a drink at a bar, whatever. Even though Alice and Charlie never created payment channels with each other. And so this is also sort of the promise of the Lightning Network. You'll be able to pay people that you've never met before, never made transactions with before, know nothing about, without making new on-chain transactions, and it's still fully trustless by pushing money through this network. So I said full decentralized exchange. You can't do a full decentralized exchange, to the best of my knowledge, with just a time lock and a multisig, because you need discovery. You need some way for Alice, Bob, and Charlie to all realize that each other exist. And you need some way to do routing. You need some way to solve routing. And I think you're going to need some sort of out-of-band service, maybe like a BitTorrent tracker, or you could make a blockchain that serves as a tracker, a decentralized tracker. But you'll need some help beyond just knowing how to make payment channels to get a full decentralized exchange. But I think you can do it with relatively minimal effort, at least compared to some other projects that we've seen. Cool. floor for questions. I want to ask, does everybody feel like they understand how to make a one-way payment channel? So raise your hand if you don't feel like you get it all the way. Okay, good. So no, okay, awesome. That's probably the most important thing, and then the rest was just like cool candy.
So for Monero,
yeah,
can you? I guess the time locks would be the thing that prevents you from doing this.
Yeah, I don't think Monero has time locks, right?
Yeah, I don't think they do.
I don't think they do. And I think for Mimblewimble, this also proved to be a big problem initially. I don't think Mimblewimble had time locks either. I think, I'm going to say with not complete certainty, I think that Andrew Polstra figured out how to shoehorn time locks into Mimblewimble, which means you can do this stuff.
There's a couple of different ways to do it. I don't know which way he went with, but yeah.
Yeah.
Can you do secure payment routing using two one-way channels? Because I don't think you can.
What do you mean by secure payment routing?
Like network payment routing.
So I would argue, it depends on what you mean by secure. I would argue that you can do secure payment routing using the same technique that I described earlier, where you start with a very small transaction and you scale it up exponentially as you push money through a party and you trust them more. Or really, you minimize the total percent damage they can have. And so I would call that sufficiently secure, but I don't think you can use these primitives to get like 100% definitely can't cheat even a single Satoshi type security out of this primitive. You would need HTLCs and some of the other Lightning Network features that we glossed over or chose not to use.